Cool. Let's begin. Uh, there are four broad ground rules before we begin. One, always take notes. The only way to improve is if you're actually writing stuff down because then you'll remember it. If you're lying in your bed just watching the video, won't work. Two, always ask questions. The more you ask, the more personal you're able to get, the more specific answers we'll be able to give you, and you will actually be able to help your development. Generic feedback will only get you so far. If you engage more, it's better for your own debate development. Third, please fill the feedback form at the end. I will be sharing one. If you don't fill it, we can't make better sessions that are more targeted and helpful for you. So you're at a loss if we don't get good feedback. So please make sure to fill the feedback. Fourth and finally, Zoom meetings end in 40 minutes because Zoom is a little shit. And therefore, at the when 35 minutes are up, I'll share a link for a brand new Zoom meet. Please do go ahead and join that one instead. And yeah, that's everything. Any questions for now? I hope not. Amazing. Okay, we're broadly going to be covering a few things in this, particularly relevant to data-driven improvement. And the first one is the improvement sheet. And this is going to be an incredibly important resource for all of you. Uh, First of all, major thank you to Hadar Goldberg. This is a sheet who I have ripped off of her. So you're getting training materials straight from like world's best speaker. And this has been seriously helpful in my personal development. This is a massive sheet. I'll take you over it one by one. I will also share the template and hopefully you'll be able to utilize it for your help as well. Cool. Starts off very basic. This is the date, the round number. So if you're in a competition, this is a round. So round number one, two, three. If this is a mock, then you can obviously write mock, the competition you're doing, your partner, the judge, the language, or your speaking position, or the like PMLO, what team were you in CGCO, how much speaks you got at the end of the comp, what the call was, were you a first or a second or a third, what the emotion was, what the theme was, what was the first piece of feedback, the feedback in detail, second feedback in detail, third feedback detail, something about general feedback. All of this is very confusing. There's much more in terms of who the OG was, what they took, who the OO was, what they took, right? Let's see why this is important first. So if you move on to the second sheet here, there's statistics. Here, you'll be able to derive multiple layers of analysis based on just filling out that previous sheet. One, where are you scoring high and where are you where are you scoring low? In terms of are you doing your best at OG or are you doing your best from the closing half? I think a lot of speakers inherently have assumptions. Oh, that I'm terrible at OG because OG you have to go first and it's so difficult. But they often don't have the data backed hypothesis in them, or they don't really know how good or bad they're doing from OG as compared to the rest of the places. This one offers you the ability to go ahead and then understand whether your strengths lie in opening half or closing half and what you need to focus on. So, one, you will get an idea about your performance by team position. You will get your overall performance in terms of how many first, seconds, and thirds are you taken. Someone is unmuted. Can we please mute? Thank you. Yes. Performance by partner. So Abhishek Acharya used to be my partner, so you'll see his face here. But you will be able to filter through multiple partners. So you'll even be able to understand how you do in response to a particular teammate. Are you stronger with a particular teammate in closing, or are you weaker with a particular teammate in opening? All of that context will also be given to you here, specifically in terms of your teammates. It's especially helpful if you don't have a permanent partner and keep rotating. There's also performance by theme. So things like if it's a feminism motion, if it's another particular motion. So over here, when we go ahead and import the motion theme, you'll be able to see IR, econ, law, feminism. You'll also be able to understand and filter by particular themes and do better with that perspective because now you will know how to approach a particular theme, which ones you're strong in, which ones you're weak in. All of this will allow you to get a better context in terms of not just where you're bad, but how particularly bad are you and which one you particularly need to improve on. Mohit, I'm so sorry, there's background noise. Can you please mute? Thank you. Cool. Uh, that's level number one. Before I continue, are there any questions as of now? Am I going too fast for you? Cool. I'm going to assume no. Uh, the second thing then we have over here is problems. So this gives you analysis not into just how, well, like into what is going bad because a lot of speakers have, when you go to a judge and they tell you, oh, this is bad, one of the questions we were even asked in our questionnaire form was that we don't get very targeted feedback from judges, or we don't know how to go ahead and get better, or what is lacking. What this does is first, it has a list of 20 issues in terms of which you can highlight, and these are possible things that can be going wrong in your speeches. Once you ask the judges targeted questions, and we'll come more to this later, you'll be able to fill these out and you will get a better idea. So over here, suppose the first feedback for me was that I have unclear headlines. I will fill that out over here and I will write in details that speech did not differentiate between extensions, for example. So when I come to this sheet, problems, unclear headlines will already have one over here, which means it already counts what are the mistakes you're most likely to make, but it's also color coded in terms of knowing which mistakes are often made. You can quickly filter it out by looking at this. There are style issues, there are content issues, there are strategy issues. This is a bit specific to BP and teamwork issues. All of this is something you list down, both from judge feedback, but two, from your personal interpretation of the debate, what you felt you were bad at, highlight that and look at recurring patterns. The best way to get better at debating is to understand your weaknesses, and that will only happen when you understand the patterns between your mistakes, which patterns are the ones you're likely to make, which patterns are the ones which are going to arise in a specific context. So, for example, in IR motions, I don't have good structure is a specific one you can get out of this sheet because now you're able to filter for all of these things. Looking at these patterns helps you understand what is going wrong and allows you to get help for that particular question. So you're constantly addressing your weaknesses and trying to make them your strengths. Again, any questions till now? Cool. So I will go over this sheet one last time, and then we will move on to more actionable terms of how you can use this sheet. The date, the round that was, the competition you were in, your teammate for that round, who the judge was, your speaking position in terms of are you going first or second, your teams in terms of all four benches, the speaks you got in that particular round. I will be sharing this sheet, don't worry. What the call was in terms of first, second, third, and fourth, the motion, the theme within the motion, uh, the feedback you got from the judges in terms of, well, was it a style issue, was it a content issue, and what specific issue it was in the debate. Detail, you can write more context about what exactly messed up within that big banner of unclear headlines. Similarly, you can incorporate up to three pieces of feedback, something good. And this is very important because I notice a lot of people just skip on this because they only want to focus on, oh, what went wrong in the debate. I think that's a terrible idea because you need to understand your strengths in order to maximize them within your speeches because you want to focus on your strengths and you want to attack the people, attack other teams at what you're best at. So noticing your strengths in a debate room is also very important. General feedback about the debate, who was opening government, what was their rank, who was opening up, what was their rank, etc., etc. There's a bonus sheet over here in terms of how to structure your prep, irrelevant for this particular workshop, but this is everything. Once again, any questions? Cool. I'll be sharing this sheet with you very soon. Please don't, I will share a read-only access. So create a copy for yourself and use it. You will not be able to write on this sheet itself. Let's move on to the slides. That's idea number one. Uh, idea following this improvement sheet, I want you to do three broad things with this improvement sheet. Unfortunately, there's nothing like this for Aegis. We will take Edge specific workshops in the future, and then we can focus on having different improvement sheets and stuff like that. I will definitely keep that in mind. Cool. Identifying strengths and weaknesses. What that does, what that sheet allows you to do, is know what you're good at and know what you're bad at. I've already talked about this. The best way to improve in debate is to understand what you're bad in very specifically. What exact problem do you have? And then going ahead and learning and trying to fix that problem through consistent practice. We'll talk more about consistent practice later, but identifying that weakness enables you to push your speaks forward. Another thing we had was in terms of, oh, I'm stuck at 78 barrier, or can't get across a particular barrier. That's very natural with debaters, and it often happens because we don't know what's going wrong, and we keep reiterating the same speech over and over again without understanding where we could have specifically improved. So identification of weaknesses is how we can go ahead and help this. Identifying strengths is very similar. in terms of what you're good at, what you don't need to focus on. Because some people, for example, I love framing. I'm good at framing. So I spend way too much time studying framing and don't spend time studying my weaknesses. That's not to say you shouldn't spend time on what you're good at to hone your skills further. I think still allocation of resources is very important, especially when debating has a multitude of topics to choose from. And I think this will go ahead and tell you what is good, what is bad, and give you objective, quantitative evaluation in how you need to improve. The second idea over here is a data driven approach. This is what I've talked to you already. The point at which you have specific data in terms of what bench you do best from, in terms of what theme you do best from, in terms of which problems arise most likely in your speeches and which ones are less likely to arise in your speeches. This numerical data is much more stronger to actually understand your debating capabilities than your own thoughts and feelings about a debate because they tend to be incredibly subjective. So this objective analysis will really help you going ahead and moving forward. And the third thing here is two things I can improve. Uh, the last thing I want to come back to is that there are three pieces of feedback that you can incorporate over here. It's really important to go ahead and do these. Don't skip these over. Uh, Basically, you can ask an edge even if you don't have so much time to spend these in detail, and in like especially during competitions where you don't have a lot of time to talk to these edges. Just go to them and ask them what are two broad things I can improve. So I will talk about this later, but keep the pieces of feedback here and make sure you're consistently filling the sheet in order to get the most accurate data about yourself. And yeah, that's everything about the sheet. Uh, what is the any column? Can you specify which sheet this was in? Where did you see any? I don't see anything that says any over here. Yeah, I guess this just means any anything else other than first, second, third, fourth. In case you have incorrect entries, I think this just gives you an insight into that. So if you accidentally put something random, it will just go in over here. Cool. Any other questions regarding the sheet? Cool. Let's move forward not to my Spotify, but to the next topic within this. Sparse and judge feedback. Sai will be taking this one up. Uh, Sai, do you want to start?
I great. Am I audible, Rohan?
Your voice is breaking a bit. Can you
Hello.
repeat a second?
Am I audible now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. A couple of things. Where I am currently, internet is quite unreliable. So unfortunately, I won't be able to show you my uh, corporate face. And secondly, I have a couple of things to say on spars and judge feedback, and the next topic, which is just how to identify stock and run it well. The reason I know this works or this is good advice is simple, right? As long as I was following this and people around me were following this, we saw change in each other at a good rate, at a respectable rate. And when we stopped, we naturally didn't improve at the same pace. Now, this can be attributed to a bunch of reasons, but I just think by experience, these things work. If people think otherwise, or if people have questions, they can take that up in the Q&A part. Cool. Spars and judge feedback. The first thing I want to address here, mm, never mind. Yeah. So the first thing that I want to address here is a question that people very commonly ask, right? How much sparring is enough sparring, or how much sparring is too much sparring? And I think the approach can be quite personal. I know people, and by people I mean people like David Africa and basically a lot of people from the Philippines. Their philosophy is to emulate comp days by having 4 spars a day and do it consistently in the run up to majors or other important competitions that they've signed up for. And I know a lot of other people, which is basically the rest of the world, which does not believe in this philosophy and they want to and try to spar judiciously. So there's a logic to both of these things, right? Let's just explore that. The first thing is, I think if you spar less, if you spar judiciously, the idea is that you are able to focus more on what you have learned from the spar. And that's the first takeaway that I want people to have from this. Whenever you enter a spar, you need to enter with an intent. The intent cannot be an intent to win. The intent cannot be an intent to become better by brute forcing your way through the spar. The intent has to be very clear, right? And this correlates to what Rohan just spoke about a minute earlier, like a couple of
And
minutes
that they
earlier,
revenge at
when
4
he
a.m. in the
talked
morning.
about identifying their own. Yeah, yeah. So about the best way to make use of spars is to enter the spar with an intent to work on your weakness. What does working on your weakness look like? It looks like two things. The first is you earmark time in your speech during the mock and force yourself to go ahead and follow that. What does this mean, right? If you are practicing word economy or being better at being less verbose or being better at efficiency, you can try giving speeches which are of 5 minutes in duration instead of speeches which are 7 minutes in duration. Of course, this statistically lowers your chances of winning. But what this improves or what this lays emphasis on is that now you're consciously forcing yourself to cram the same amount of matter in the 5 minutes that you have. Of course, a way to go about this is just to increase the speed at which you talk. But that's not quite possible, right? Because everyone has their own natural pace, which cannot be exactly altered. So the way that people can go about this is like, so what naturally ends up happening is that you're forced to be more efficient about your speeches. This also looks like having earmarked weighing, right? This can look like you assign the first minute or the minute and a half of your speech to exclusive weighing. And the question that people often have is, earmarking time is well and good, but what if you don't come up with content that is meant to fill that time? What if my 90 seconds has 10 seconds of weighing and 80 seconds of nothingness? The answer to that is simple. So be it, right? The idea is that you build your muscle memory in a way that you are forced to assign time to significant, like to specific parts in your speeches, regardless of whether you have content to fill it or not. Content generation is a consequence of getting better. Having proper structure and not missing the fundamentals is what needs to be trained into your muscle memory. You only have, say, one piece of weighing which can be wrapped in 5 minutes, or you just try and rebrand or rephrase that weighing to fill in those 90 seconds, because the intent with that mock is not to win. The intent with that mock is to force yourself to be in a position where you don't skip weighing, like as a part of your speeches, like in future rounds. And this principle applies to a lot of other things, right? If you're wanting to get better at like argumentation structure and whatnot, and if you can't come up with enough reasons, you force yourself to repeat reasons, even if you can't, because this forces you to enter the habit of earmarking or making arguments in a way that you at least have like one or like two or three reasons. And hence, when you get better and are able to fill those white spaces, you are naturally able to place them in a structure that you had hardwired your brain to process and that you had hardwired your brain to learn. Cool. That is what I mean by intent. That is forcing intent on yourself, right? But the second part of this is reflecting that intent or conveying that intent to people around you. And this is important because people around you can often be a better judge of your capability than what you yourself are. So this is concerning two people in the room, right? One, your own partner, and second, the judge. You let the judge know that this is the specific thing that I want feedback on. And regardless of whatever else happens in the speech, just give me feedback on this. This makes the judge's life easier because they know that they need to specifically track very accurately this part of your speech for the purpose of feedback, even if they're not able to track the rest of your speech, because it's spar, it's meant for learning, it's not meant for winning. But secondly, what you will be able to do through this is get an outside perspective on things, right? Because often the problem with trying to zero in on these things yourself is that you run into tunnel vision. So this is the long and short of entering a mock with intent. You specifically earmark what is it that you want to improve on, and how, like what people I want to get feedback from. And you force your speeches to be in a certain way that you end up practicing that particular skill set and nothing else. That's on what to do with intent. That's the long and short of intent. The second thing is, I think, utilizing judge feedback, right? And this is what Rohan hinted at earlier when he talked about asking two questions. So often the problem that arises is people say that they're either flooded with feedback or they receive very little to no meaningful feedback. And that's often because judges are humans as well, and they are quite literally just frazzled with how things are going. They have a couple of things, like they have a lot of things on their mind. Judging often requires more focus than speaking and those things, right? So the best way to help yourself and help your judge is to be very specific in the kind of feedback that you ask for. And this is why, even if you look at the sheet, it says two feedbacks at the very minimum, right? If you want to add a column and add more pieces of feedback per round, that's on you. But at the very, like the optimal number is just identifying two things that you can have as takeaways from every round. Because beyond this, it becomes difficult to prioritize what to optimize for the next round. And anything lesser than this is just a bit too less content to take away from one spar, is what I would say. So the next, like the second thing that I would want to cover under spars and judge feedback is what questions you ask your judges. The first thing is often be very specific in how much feedback you're looking for from your judges, right? The best way, or the easiest or the most universally known way for mankind is to quantify it. And I've seen a lot of speakers do this when they ask, can you give me two things to improve on, either for my entire speech or for my case strategy or for a particular skill set that I was trying to reflect in my speech? That's one way to ask targeted feedback. The other way to ask targeted feedback is if you have a judge who is judging you over a repeated string of spars, right? This happens more in a coach, like mentor-mentee setup. But what you can ask these people who have known you for a long period of time is if they are able to spot any specific trends in what has improved or what has deteriorated. I think asking these specific questions is what will ultimately help you fill up the sheet properly. Because obviously, all of this information cannot be retained nor be consumed meaningfully in one day or one night. It has to go on a sheet, which then reflects a broader trend. These are specific cues for you to work on, and these are specific cues for you to pick up, which you can then implement in your spas. That's the second thing. The last thing is something that has worked wonderfully for me, and I will then move on to the next section after this. I think often the most obvious question after a side concludes their case is, have I missed something? Or was there something more to it than what my eye could meet? And this is a question that people at all levels of debating face themselves with, right? I think the best way to deal with this, especially in spars, is to actually acquire meaningful knowledge, right? What has worked for me and people around me in the past is that whenever we spar, after the spar, we try to exchange two or three articles on the motion that was just debated. This works quite intuitively for hard themes because they're well covered in media. But even if these are soft themes like relationships, philosophy, and those kinds of things, right? There are plenty of resources that are available on the open web which allow you to navigate these soft ideas, such as Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if I'm getting that correct, blogs on parenting, and a lot of YouTube channels on parenting and whatnot. The reason I say that this works or this exercise should be put into practice, at least exchanging some kind of media, at the very minimum two articles with your partner, is for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that there are no better sources of examples than media, right? Because they will be able to give the most accurate example for what the debate was about. If the debate is about giving equal rights as people to, say, environment, if you are like, or to the Amazon or to any specific environmental entity, articles, media, publications, YouTube channels, and their videos, like whatever you are able to consume around this will give you the most accurate depiction of what an example on this is, right? And examples are incredibly important because they are what stay in people's minds, right? And like it's just extremely useful as a part of your speeches as well. But what is more useful is it helps people visualize their own case, and it helps judges visualize the cases that people run. So that's the first massive benefit that I feel like that I personally feel this exercise has, right? Because examples become incredibly important when you want to really drive your point home visual, like in a very visual manner. The second thing that this does quite intuitively is just explain to you how it exactly works, right? If it's a motion about parenting and a particular kind of parenting which has been practiced in the past, or there are guides on that kind of parenting on the internet, you get very specific analysis or very specific what do I say, commentaries on how this exactly works, right? If it is a parenting style which deals with anger, it an article will probably tell you about how the child is going to react, how the family, like the parent, is going to react after that, what happens in the interim when this action is initiated, and things like that. That quite literally is the content that you have generated in prep time and run in your debate. What these articles do on a secondary level is just help you get better analysis straight off the bat without even you want needing to search for it. The reason I say this again works is because this is better than the alternative method, right? The alternative method is to case file and one day pray to God that this material will be useful to me somewhere in my life. I think this reverse engineers the entire process, and this is far more useful because now you're able to exactly see what kind of case filing material would have been useful in what context. So, this is why I think this small but very useful exercise of exchanging some information that was published on the open web with your partner regarding the motion after the mock is incredibly useful. Those are my three takeaways for spars and judging feedback. We'll just jump on to the last section. Perfect. Um, Great. I hope the bit about the main takeaways from the spars and judge feedback aspect of things was clear. Before moving on to identification of stock and clashes, I'll just deal with questions which I was able to register on chat before we left the previous meet. The first one was about how many comps is too many comps. I think definitely you shouldn't do a comp every weekend. I know this might be very hypocritical of me to say, and for a lot of people to say, but it genuinely doesn't help you, right? Um, I think there are some instances where doing too many comps is justified. If you're preparing for a major, the reason you would want to do a lot of pre ABP comps or pre Worlds comps is because you want that visibility going into that major, not just from teams and the exposure that you will get by facing the same kind of teams in a similar simulated environment, but also the judges, right? For example, I think Osaka was an insanely important tournament for anyone who was judging at ABP because it's the same ABP core. So when they do Alocs, they check your feedback. They might want to cap watch you in certain rounds. So that is insanely useful for you because that really plays into the actual tournament as well. Believe it or not, a lot of debating is still based around positive biases, positive experiences that people draw from each other, recency bias, and all of it. The more you tap into it, the better for you. That is an instance where doing more comps is justified. The reason I think the way people do comps right now is unjustified is because people do it mindlessly, and I'm also guilty of it. So I would say what like the best thing to do is try to like if there is a purpose to the comp, and by purpose I mean some kind of prep that's going on, then it's fine. Either you are checking a dynamic with a new teammate, or you are trying to improve on a particular skill set. You are trying to go ahead and explore a circuit that you have never been to. If there is a point, then do the comp. If there is not, then probably you are just doing the comp because you really enjoy debating. So if you are okay with the trade-off of having that weekly dose of dopamine in exchange for no returns, that's fine. That's a personal choice. But if you are really focused on prep and you are in the mindset that this is the only thing that I want, like the only thing I want in life is to improve, then I would probably say not like doing a comp every weekend is not worth it. The second question was on fast speakers. I think that's a extremely off tangent question for this workshop. I'll just very briefly say what I think I would make of that question. I think the easiest way to deal with fast speakers is just to watch more rounds with them in it. And all the better if there are recorded OS, in order to understand how your tracking differs from that of a judge. I think the best way to deal with people who you can't seem to be dealing with right now is to judge them. Because that's when you put yourself in a mindset where you want to actively look for gaps and want to actively critique the argument in a very neutral way. That is what has worked for me. Different things might work for different people. Judge more, particularly in the circuit where you face this issue. And the last question was around analysis, right? If you are not good at analysis, should you force yourself to do it? Yes. The reason that I think of, I can think of for this idea of doing analysis, even if you think, and by analysis, I think you are asking what you refer to as if you're not good at generating mechanisms or things like that. The reason you should do it, the reason you should spend time if you're not currently good at it, is because you are not prioritizing enough time for it during prep and you're not asking the right questions, right? When you're actively going in with the mindset that the only thing that I care about today is analysis, that is all you will spend your prep thinking about. Those are all the questions that you will have in your mind. And when you do this for a significant period of time, you will understand what kind of questions I need to ask myself in order to generate mechanisms that I was previously not able to do. And I think this works because over time, you're able to recognize a pattern in terms of what requires to be asked of the motion in order to come up with meaningful analysis. This is also important because otherwise you end up in a scatterbrain situation, right? Where you look at the motion, and every time you look at the motion, you have different things going around your head, which is not a bad thing, but that means you have a different approach to every round. When you streamline your approach by forcing yourself to do a technique before every round, you go in with the same mindset and same set of questions into every round, and you're able to streamline your prep a lot better. Your prep is 50% of what the call is going to be. So that now becomes really important. So I would say yes, even if you're struggling right now, empirically I've seen that it won't be the case for too long. Cool. I'll just rush the last section then. I think this is a very fun section, right? Because this is a very useful advice. And I think this is the most high reward advice that I've ever gotten in debating. So the advice is simple. All themes are more or less made up of 10 to 12 clashes, right? There might be more, there might be less. I'm just giving a average ballpark number. If it's econ, the most common clashes are going to be is money or is more income the best way of assessing growth in a country? Does trickle down economics works? Do laborers or do workers need more protection and things like that? And whether this is good for the economy and good for themselves or not. So these are very basic fundamental questions that a lot of debates are going to have. There are a lot of debates about redistribution. When you read anything about taxation, when you read anything about forced redistribution in other ways, either by the state allocating real estate and things like that, that's about redistribution. And there are also a lot of debates about development, right? What's the best way to develop? What's the right way to develop? Whether it's equity, like equality in terms of development, giving everyone an equal pedestal to grow, or is it equity where you go ahead and focus on the most like the most underprivileged first and then other sections? So there are a bunch of clashes that are all very intuitive to us. The data part comes in now. The best way to go about this is to go to any debate database and look up motions on a particular theme, right? And be a bit more specific. If you're doing social justice, don't just say social justice on debate data. You're going to end up with a lot of motions which are quite variant. You should be quite specific. If it's the queer movement that you want debates around, type in queer movement and gather 10 motions around it. Do a 5 minute prop prep for it, do a 5 minute op prep for it. And if you can come up with, or if you can identify clashes, well and good. At least you will be, in the worst case, you'll still be able to identify arguments from both sides. Do this for all 10 motions.
Now you will see that a lot of clashes and a lot of arguments are repeating themselves. Arrange them in an ascending order, and that is the order of priority in which you should practice your clashes, right? What you have in front of yourself is the most commonly occurring, like at least the top 3 or 4 will be the most commonly occurring clashes in this particular theme. The way to now work on this is to go ahead and matter file through art, like this is what works for me at least. Matter file through articles and other information on the internet, both sides, right? If the simplest clash, like the simplest clash in economics, the two simplest clashes are: should the market like remain free, or should there be government intervention? Does trickle down economics work, or does it not? There is an insane amount of literature that's published for all sides of this clash, right? Both these clashes. So I think once you're like in economics, it's quite intuitive. Once you're able to identify these clashes, I think what you should really do is that you should matter file them. I think the obvious question is going to be that this is not rocket science. The part which is difficult is implementing this in rounds, right? And this is where I think now debate videos come into the picture. Knowing that a central clash is going to be invoked in a round, when you go into that information and watch a HWS round robin video or a video of similar quality, it can also be an Indian tournament. Like there are a bunch of very good Indian rounds online. What you will now see is how do these speakers run the same arguments. And what you will now see are things which can often only be seen if you debate more and more. A, what is the weighing that sides use in order to beat the other argument? And this is important information that can go into your matter file or go into your brain or whatever it is. What is the kind of characterization and what actors do people choose to characterize at the very top of their setup, and things like that. So it's a combination of identifying the most commonly occurring clashes, and through information on the open web and through recorded rounds, trying to understand what is the best available form of that clash in the world, and trying to file that in your matter file. That, I think, is a very good data driven approach to understanding these things. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think this also works for rebuttal, right? Because if everyone masters their ability to do this, even for 1 or 2 themes, we might end up in a situation where we are again at a deadlock because everyone has the same skill set and everyone has the same umpire advantage over the other person. I think what really becomes important is also doing rebuttal the same way, right? And this is also something that works quite often. Is you look at a video, you look at an argument, you track it, and you write 10 possible responses that you can think of. Take your own sweet time. Then order them from 1 to 10, and then play the video again. And then look at the way the other side has responded to this team. If your prioritization of responses is somewhat similar to the prioritization of the responses that the other speakers have done, and if the other speakers have been able to explain why these responses work the way they do, then you will be able to get a better understanding of what response to prioritize and how to actually explain the importance of or implication of certain responses in certain rounds. So the same approach of collecting all the possible responses to an argument and trying to prioritize them and trying to see what order they go in is something that can often. Oh, yeah, never mind. I thought I disconnected. Something that can often work in these instances. So I think this is the broad idea around trying to matter file both clashes, the way that they're actually run in debates, and also rebuttal. I won't say you should matter file rebuttal. It's more of an exercise of how you can have a actual approach to understanding how to prioritize rebuttal. But it's the concept is quite literally the same. It all flows from the same thing. So I think that's the most important bit in identifying stock as well, right? Because the second question that this approach answers is what people keep asking when they enter debating: how to get good at stock. I think the easier answer is to debate for 2 years and then you'll know. But the more meaningful answer is to go ahead and actually identify what the core issues of any debate become in a particular theme, and trying to prepare those core issues from both sides before you enter into a round. And I think a publicly available resource which wonderfully displays this, And actually, this is the advice that those people only gave me. I think you can look up Sriram and Ayana's matter file, which I think is on Mixedia. It was there for a long period of time at least. In the description, I think they have matter filed their ideas in the same way, and it is a very good description or a depiction of how to do this well. And this is something that definitely worked for them. Post this, they broke worlds. Not to say that they obviously had other things going for them beyond this, but this significantly helps you cut down unnecessary time that you might otherwise keep aside for thinking of things as trivial as this. So that is the broad idea on identification of stock and clashes. I think that is it from my side. Are there, how does, okay, I'll just look at the questions very specifically. How does one practice clashes?
Sai, I'll
Um,
pause you for a second. Before we move forward, one very important thing, everyone, please do fill feedback. It's something I've put in the link tree as well. I'll send you the link right now. Please make sure to fill feedback for this form. This was everything that we had in theory. We'll take questions one by one now.
can anyone share that matter file? Um, should be on Mixi. I'll just look it up and try to put the link. How does one practice clashes? If I'm prepping both sides, how do I use the one side of my prep? Oh, you do it with the partner. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped this part. Because the idea generally is that you would want this understanding to be, so if I have a very good and thorough understanding of one clash, but I go in with a partner who still has the need to understand and prep that for 7 minutes of prep, then this is not the best time optimization, right? So the best way to often do this is to do it with a specific partner you know you will be doing a lot of comps with. So that way you are able to bypass the issue of, okay, how do I beat my own case on the other side, but also actually making meaningful use of this. Because even if you have all the clashes by hearted and the ways to run them on both sides, the issue is you will still spend time conveying this to your partner in prep, and that is still a not a net negative scenario, but a less than optimal situation. So I think that's the idea of how to practice clashes. Sometimes if I'm very uninformed about a topic, does it make to sense? Oh, yeah. So I think okay, yeah, this is a good question. I'll give my own example. I was very bad at social justice movements when I started debating because I was obviously a very unaware engineering kid. So I think the way that this really helps, or I'll tell you the first two things that stuck to me, or that really stood out to me. The first thing was, how come people have so many examples on this motion? And that's the first useful thing to take away from a debate where you have zero spec. There's a lot of jargon that people are going to throw around, and there are a lot of examples that people are going to throw around, which are quite useful because those are your starting points to read, right? Because there's a reason people have thrown around those specific jargons and examples so many times in that particular debate. So I think that becomes an excellent way for you to understand where exactly you should start reading. An example is Stonewall riots, right? I was doing this debate on some like queer movement schisming or something it is, and I think someone mentioned the word Stonewall twice. I looked it up. I understood that this was a movement where people mobilized themselves after something that shook their conscience, and this is a very good example to explain why shock value works or how exactly this entire thing came into being or whatever it is. I think similarly, this is quite useful because otherwise you will spend time searching for these examples on the open web. I think another classic example is the Evergrande crisis, right? Honest to God, Evergrande crisis is not even in the top 15 reasons why China is suffering right now. Sure, it might be in the top 15, but it has ceased to be the one of the most important reasons. It was sure definitely a reason in 2022, but it is not a reason in 2024. But the number of times speakers will use this in a debate about China is mind-boggling. So you will only know that these are mechanisms which people run almost every time they do a motion about China's economy failing. It's if you are present in that mock and you tune in despite you knowing nothing. So now you know that Evergrande crisis is a thing that everyone is in love with and something that you definitely need to read up before you enter the next China mock. So I think that's the first reason that you should still do it. And I think the second reason is just like the idea of reading up is so difficult, right? What do you read up with? How do you know what to retain while reading up on something? And a lot of times you will end up reading up on stuff that isn't useful, right? Instead of being very specific, like if it's about the environmental movement blasting up pipelines or blasting up other infrastructure in order to gain shock value and things like that. I think rather than reading the general impacts of this, what becomes quite more useful is reading specific case studies. I think those starting points or those like cues are something that you better understand from mocks. And the second thing is, I think if in a mock you enter, you know nothing, and people thrash you, that's a memory you'll have for the rest of your life. I remember doing a mock about Macron. It was my first mock as an actor motion, and I read a lot about Macron after that, safe to say. And that is something that I very vividly remember till date. So I just think that it makes for a good starting point, and it definitely makes for a good understanding of what can happen if you go in unprepared in a round. Um, yeah, the next question is I'm just trying to finish the questions at the top before I go into the ones which have come in later. Also, Rohan, please feel free to chip in whenever.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
Does it make sense to do mocks on specific subject areas? Um, so I would say yes, because and this is some like so the question is if I am shit at econ, should I do it for the next month or so? I think the obvious downside is you will dread the next month of debating. But the thing is, people won't stop setting econ. And people will set weird as econ, things like something like Dutch auction, which you would have never heard of. So I think in those instances, it becomes quite important to bear yourself through that. Sure, you might not see the exact same concept in like the seven mocks you do, but you will see something that is somewhere on the periphery. If it's a motion about Dutch auction, which is some weird way of doing IPOs, you will do at least one motion on IPOs if you're picking your motions wisely in the Spar. So I think yes, because you then understand at least the broad concept that is like that you can run in these debates. And of course, it's just about building confidence. It is not that if you don't like you should mock until the point of no return. I think it's generally is until you're quite confident in that round and you're not trembling while giving your speech. I think that's a good litmus test to understand whether you are prepared for these kinds of things, and then you can shift course, change focus. Because there are a lot of other ways that people prep, right? Going into majors, people prep people specific motions. If Sharun is DCing ABP, I will pick up 20 motions that that person has set and try to do all of them in order to get an understanding of the way that this person sets motions, because believe it or not, everyone has a method to the madness of setting motions. So I think later on, obviously, the way you prep motions changes. But I think earlier in your speaking journey, you should definitely do it until you're no longer scared of that topic. Are there any other questions? What is the aging to speaking ratio? Depends on the individual. This is a very subjective question because some people start up as ages and want to transition later on. Some people only speak for 20 comps and then think that aging might not be such a bad idea after all. I would say obviously a balanced approach is good. One thing that I can say from experience is when you keep getting thrashed every weekend as a speaker, you should definitely go and judge, because the judges are not stupid. It is you who is being stupid day in and day out and not understanding what exactly it is that you need to improve on. When you judge and across multiple circuits like the European and North American, the Filipino, that's when I think you can like judging opens up your perspective into speaking like nothing else, because you finally understand what a judge wants, what their thresholds can be, and things like that. So I would say that you should balance those things up, but obviously that depends on the person. But if you ask me, I would say balance is good. I think Rohan can have a different perspective, since I think Rohan did a lot of judging first and then a lot of speaking.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Sairam is saying. There are two broad things over here. One, I think aging is just purely good for like if you're burnt out of speaking, like when you keep losing, like Sairam mentioned about, even if it's not just for, like for no other reason, just to chill out in debating and relax a bit. I think it's an excellent time to go ahead and age. Second, I think there are a lot of invaluable skills you gain as an age. One is what we talked about in terms of clashes and stock. I think once you have a third person perspective of how stock is being run or what is a likely clash or a stock in a debate, especially as a match when you have 15 minutes of prep time to just sit there where you can preemptively think of all the arguments that can be run. I think this is excellent for you to go ahead and understand this. Second, I think your tracking massively improves. So often with things like rebuttal and stuff, what is the biggest problem is people don't rebut the meat of someone else's case and they rebut random lines. I think Ajing forces you to understand the depth and the extent of someone else's case and therefore makes it easy for you to do things like tracking and rebuttal as a speaker. So a lot of skills that you wouldn't necessarily want transferred to your speaking can also come from Ajing. So I think there's a healthy ratio to be maintained, but it's the number depends on person to person and on your financial constraints as well. So
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a very fair way to put it, especially the financial constraint part. Judging is just way more affordable usually because it's free in 90% of the comps around the world. So it's improvement for practically no fee. So that way it's quite a good ROI. Um, ha, okay, the next question is how to speak or how to talk sense in a round where I have too much spec. I think that's the crux of Ojas's question. Um, that actually is a good question. I think a couple of things. The first thing that has often helped me in these kinds of things or these kinds of cases is I think the problem is that you know too many examples. And when you know too many examples, what ends up happening is that you make your cases very context specific. So the way to deal with this, or I what I think has worked for people around me and for me in the past is I think just to put out whatever like whatever I am thinking of in that moment and asking my partner to gut check me and trying to see what the most useful context or an example can be. Because I think 90% of the cases, it is literally that I know too much about this because I know 25 examples around it. I might be wrong, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me on chat. But I like this is what has happened to me for like one or two subject areas. I think the idea is first to understand what example you want to run the case around. And by that I don't mean that case is example is your case, but it's the premise or it's the essence of what your case is going to prove. And that gut check I think often comes from a partner who is better able to explain what context this works better in. The second one, or this like the easier way to go about it is, I think depending on the side, right? Now, this might not be the cleanest answer, but I think these kinds of situations are better when you're in closing because you know the very different ways in which the motion works because you have so much spec. I think in opening, the idea is just to run cases which are as safe as possible, the most intuitive stuff. And in closing, I think the easiest check is what you would anyways do for any closing case. Can I weigh this case or this example around which my case is based? If the answer is yes, then that is something that you can run. If the answer is no, then like all other extensions which don't pass this check, you should just drop it. That is my say on knowing too much in a round.
yeah,
Um, the
adding
next
to that,
question is, yeah, go
wait,
ahead.
yeah. So one of the biggest struggles I've seen, especially as a computer science engineer in like a fuck ton of AI debates, is necessarily people will always talk back and they will still win because the problem is you, because you know so much, make a lot of premises in your debate that might be obvious to you but are not obvious to the judge. In which case, the judges don't credit your arguments because they feel too far-fetched. To that extent, it's very important when you're making arguments on a topic you have a lot of knowledge about to ask yourself the information I'm presenting, is it readily understandable by the judge? Is it readily trackable by the judge? To the extent you don't think that's true, all of your arguments will not be credited, even if you think they're right, even if they should be the perfect argumentation. So you need to dumb down your arguments intentionally to make it much more tangible and much more logical for the person in front of you.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, this is quite true. Uh, People just jump premises, and that's what leads to their defeat, even if they know too much. And I think what Rohan said on that was quite spot on. Um, actually has happened to me in a couple of debates. The next question is, as is there any particular way to improve impacting and integrating weighing within that? Uh, I think the integrating bit is just honestly practice. Um, because I think impacting is one skill and weighing is a different one. Of course, these two are heavily correlated because you can't weigh fast. Um, I think the easier thing to understand, like the more important thing to understand, is how to impact well, because that is where people suffer a lot. Again, I am big on consuming knowledge, so this is what my advice often is. This just to understand how an impact actually pans out, right? If a mechanism is the Evergrande crisis crippled the Chinese economy, I think reading an article will tell you the specific way in which it created a money shortage for what China's priorities at the time were. That's, I think, the more honest answer I would give. But in debate land, what I have seen to work is, I think you try to think of a state when it comes to debating. You think of what stakeholder you are going to impact. Because if you don't have a conscious stakeholder in your mind, you will say things which are abstract, like, oh, you'll have more happiness, oh, you'll have more money, which don't make any sense, honestly. So I think the way to understand impacting can be what people literally quite literally do in their first mocks. This is my stakeholder for this debate, when like and things like that. I think you don't say it, but you do it consciously. When you start impacting, you explain how it impacts a specific stakeholder. And by specific, I don't mean society. Society is not specific. Within society, is it going to be young babies? Within society, is it going to be old women? Within society, is it going to be gay people? Within society, is it going to be white Americans or the working class Americans? Anything, right? Because if you are not accurate or precise around what stakeholder you want to explain the impact around, then you are just explaining it in a vacuum. If you just say that swing voting will now improve in the US because Kamala Harris suddenly has a pro-Palestine stance, that means nothing. Who are these swing voters who earlier were not pro Kamala by virtue of her stance? Was this the radical left, which like usually votes Bernie, but since Bernie never gets voted as the candidate, like they either don't vote at all or like whatever it is? Is it that, like those kinds of people? Is it like a bunch of industrialists? Is it specifically maybe the African American population in the US, or whatever it is? Is it the Muslim diaspora? You need to be very specific when you explain these things, right? Because otherwise it runs into the obvious trouble of this just doesn't make any sense. Uh, Numerous examples of that, such as like this idea that, oh, now swing voters will increase on your side. The number one question that any judge will have is, who is the swing voter? Am I a swing voter, or are you a swing voter? So things like that. So I think in debate land, this approach works. Thinking of a state, truly believe the honest way to go about it is to read more. But both those approaches work, I think. How to improve clarity and practice explaining to a 5-year old. Um, so I don't have anything meaningful to say on this. I'll just be honest. I know people who do this well. So if you want recommendations of whose videos to watch, I can give them to you. I think Robert Rouse is a very good example. But yeah, I think like just being very simple with your mechanisms is also an insane skill. which comes with time. I think the better question to like it's still a like very far off thing for the place where all of us find ourselves at. I think the better thing to just focus on is how do I land the correct analysis. Clarity in analysis is an advanced skill, is what I truly believe. I think the more important thing right now is just to land the correct analysis. So that's what I would say on that question specifically. Um, I usually don't have a teammate, but I intend to practice speaking. Should I iron person rounds or team up with random people? I just personally am against iron personing. I think it's very tiring. I think you have no one to bounce your ideas off of. I think there is no process of refinement in what happens. And I think everyone is too much of a dick to give correct feedback in 90% of the cases. So that's all the reasons why I think a teammate is preferred. Um, I would enthusiasm and experience as you that even if it is not, say, an institutional partner, 4 or 5 people put together debating between themselves for mocks is, I think, a good starting point for something like this. You find a bunch of people when you come to tournaments, you often end up speaking to them. I think entertaining this idea with them would be great. The second thing is just find people at your own level. Everyone is very success driven and hungry for a win. I think even just people ask people who are way more experienced to do mocks or just to judge mocks that you're in. I think people underestimate this and don't think it works, but it actually does. Sure, if you ask 10 times, they will agree in maybe 1 or 2 instances, but even those 1 or 2 instances can be quite useful. So I would say try to find a community of people if you can't find 1 or 2 constant partners, because all the advices that have been given out in this session, I personally feel that works better with the partner. I know a lot of people who disagree with me, everyone on Mixi who keeps add personing every day, but I just personally don't have that kind of stamina. So I just don't see much point in add personing. But it's just like if you feel that is a better and more accurate reflection of what you are as a debater, sure. But I would just generally advise against it. There are a lot of moral issues also which come with it and whatnot. So the best is to find a community of people. And even if you can't find a community of people, I think the idea is just to mock like with people who are significantly more experienced, either by asking them or yeah, like I think a community is rather easy to find, because I think at every stage of debating there are at least 20 people who are very enthused about mocks and keep doing it on an everyday or an alternate day basis. So it is not that difficult to find one. Sure, you don't have to be permanent buddies or teammates with them, but I think that's a good starting point. Finding a community like 5, 6 people who mock every other day. Okay, yeah, this I will
Okay.
do now.
Pause. Yes, there's 1.5 minutes left. I'm going to link to a Google Meet in case anyone has more questions. But for all intents and purposes, this session is over.